Hello beautiful, in this video, we'll be sewing a vest without an overlock and without a lining. The written instructions demonstrate how to sew this vest using an overlock. I'll show you how to finish the raw edges and make the inside of the vest look neat. Let's start with the back pieces of the vest. Since I didn't have much fabric, I cut out the back pieces of the pattern with seam allowances at the place where the fabric should fold. The first step is to transfer the location of the shoulder dart from one back piece to the other using hand stitches. I'm using a method I learned during my training. If you know faster methods, please write about them in the comments. I'll be happy to read them. I've also already stitched the center back seam. I pinned the darts on the wrong side of the back piece. Then, I sew the dart. Since I'm sewing a vest without a lining, it's important to hide all threads inside. That's why I tie knots at the ends of the darts and tuck the thread ends inside the dart. Why can't you just cut the thread ends after tying knots? Firstly, the seam may unravel during wearing the vest, and secondly, it's simply not aesthetically pleasing to leave trimmed thread ends, especially if the garment is sewn without a lining. The center seam needs to be pressed closed, then the seam allowances are opened and pressed flat. If your back piece is cut as one piece, you can skip this step. Press the shoulder darts towards the center back. Join the center back piece with the side back pieces. Start sewing from the bottom edges of the pieces upwards. Make sure to join the pieces with the right sides facing inwards. Sew them together. First, press the seams closed. Turn the back piece to the wrong side to press the seam allowances towards the center back. I've also stitched the facings for the bottom and neckline of the back piece. The facings for the armhole, neckline, and bottom edge of the back piece need to be interfaced with interfacing. I apply the interfacing to the wrong side of the fabric. When cutting the interfacing for the armhole facings, make sure you determine the correct direction to cut. We want the vertical armhole facings not to stretch. Check in which direction the interfacing stretches more and less. Cut the interfacing for the armhole facings in the direction where the interfacing has the least stretch. Since I have a seam down the center of the neckline facing, I press it open and trim the seam allowances, leaving 0.2 mm so that when I join the facing to the neckline, there are no unnecessary fabric bulges in the center of the back piece. If we needed to cut the interfacing for the armhole facing so that the facings wouldn't stretch vertically, then when cutting the interfacing for the neckline facing, we need to ensure that the neckline doesn't stretch horizontally. Before sewing all the facings to the back piece, we need to first finish all the raw edges of the seam allowances. Since the center back seam is open, I take one seam allowance and fold it inward, pinning it in place. I do the same on the other side, folding the seam allowance inward and pinning it. Before sewing the seams on the sewing machine, I secure the seam allowances with hand stitches. If your center back piece is cut as one piece, you can skip this step and proceed directly to finishing the relief seams. So, to conceal the raw edges without using an overlock machine, you need to trim the bottom seam allowance to leave 0.5 centimeters. and fold the top seam allowance so that the already trimmed bottom seam allowance is inside the top one. I secure the seam allowances with hand slip stitches. Now, you need to sew 2 stitches, first along the edge of the folded seam allowance from the wrong side of the back piece. Then, after turning the back piece to the right side, I additionally sew a finishing stitch 0.1 centimeters from the line of the relief seam. Before attaching the facings, it's important to check the armhole and neckline lines at the bottom of the back piece. Since there may be irregularities and inaccuracies during the assembly of the pieces, these lines need to be aligned. To do this, I fold the back piece in half with the right side facing inwards and align the armhole line. Now we can sew on the facings. I place the facings with the right side facing the right side of the back piece. I align the center line of the facing with the center line of the back piece. I also see that I need to align the bottom line of the back piece. I sew the facings to the back piece. Do not forget that it is necessary to tack at the beginning and at the end of the seam. Let's move on to sewing the front of the vest. First, I need to transfer the center line and the placement of buttons and buttonholes from the pattern onto the pieces. I recommend marking these lines with additional hand stitches because all the lines we mark with chalk during the cutting process can disappear during ironing. The buttonhole length in the pattern is set at 1.5 centimeters. If you are using larger buttons, you will need to increase the length of the loop accordingly. In the same way, I transfer the center line and button placements onto the second front piece. Since seam allowances are included in the pattern, transferring lines to the other front piece of the vest is easy. Just lay the pattern piece down. There's no need, as with darts, to transfer the line placements using hand stitches from one piece to another. Since I mentioned at the very beginning that I will mark the lines using hand stitches, this is to ensure that the lines remain visible during the pressing process, as the drawn lines may disappear. Hand-stitched lines are more reliable. I join the side parts of the vest with the front center pieces. I sew the pieces together from the bottom to the top. Stitching them together, I press the seam allowances towards the center front. just as I did for the back piece, to conceal the raw edges. I repeat this process for the front pieces of the vest. I trim the bottom seam allowance to leave 0.5 centimeters. I fold the top seam allowance in half so that the bottom seam allowance is inside the top one. Then, I secure them with hand stitches. I sew 2 finishing stitches 0.1 centimeters from the folded seam allowance on the wrong side of the piece. Then, I turn the piece to the right side and sew a second finishing stitch 0.1 centimeters from the relief seam line. I interface the armhole facings with interfacing on the wrong side. Remember to cut the interfacing so that the armhole facings don't stretch vertically. My front facing is also made up of several pieces because I had limited fabric. I trim the seam allowances, leaving 0.2 millimeters. When cutting the interfacing for the front facing, make sure that vertically, the interfacing has the least stretch. I place the facings with the right side facing the right side of the front piece. I pin them in place and sew them to the front piece of the vest. In areas where there are corners, I trim the seam allowances, stopping 0.1 millimeters before the seam. I make a couple of notches along the armhole and neckline lines of the front piece and the back piece. Now we can join the front pieces to the back piece along the side seams. First, we need to unfold the seam allowances for joining the pieces with the facings. I open the seam allowances at the bottom and along the armhole on the back piece. I also unfold the seam allowances at the bottom and along the armhole on the front piece. Now, we can join the front piece to the back piece along the side seams. Similarly, on the shoulder edges of the pieces, we need to unfold the seam allowances. For convenience, I secure the seam allowances in the unfolded position with pins. Then, I join the front piece to the back piece along the shoulder seam. To finish the raw edges of the side seams, we need to make notches. Starting from the seam where the facing is attached to the vest piece, make a notch on both sides. These notches will allow us to fold the seam allowance inward, just like we did for the center back seam. So, on the side and shoulder seams, make these notches, fold the seam allowances inward, and secure them with hand stitches. Then, sew 2 finishing stitches. The same process needs to be repeated on the shoulder seams to conceal the raw edges. First, I make notches on each side of the seam allowance. This will allow me to fold the seam allowance inside and secure it. Initially, I pin the seam allowances in place and then stitch them by hand. Additionally, 2 rows of finishing stitches need to be sewn, just like we did for the center back seam. Now, you can turn the facings to the right side and also finish them with hand stitches. The finishing stitches should be done on the wrong side of the vest. I sew the first finishing stitch 0.1 centimeters away from the edge. And the second finishing stitch 0.5 centimeters away from the edge. I'll cover the raw edges of the facings with bias binding. I attach the bias binding with the right side facing the right side of the facing. It's convenient to use bias binding because it has markings for seam allowances. I use cotton bias binding with a 1 cm seam allowance. There are different sizes of bias binding with different seam allowances. Choose the one that suits your fabric type and design preferences. I began attaching the bias tape from the center of the back. I finished attaching it at the same point, leaving a 1 cm seam allowance folded inward at the beginning and a 1 cm seam allowance at the end of the bias tape. When I fold the bias tape in half, these seam allowances will ensure the closure of the beginning and end of the bias tape. I fold the bias binding in half and pin it in place. Then, I sew 2 stitches to secure the binding from the other side. I repeat the same process to finish the raw edges of the armhole facings. Before doing this, I trim any excess seam allowances to align the armhole lines. The facings at the seams where the vest pieces are joined together need to be secured with hand stitches to prevent them from flipping to the right side when the vest is worn. These hand stitches should be loose, not tight. The last step is to make buttonholes. Before making buttonholes on the vest, I always try and test several times on a fabric scrap. I switch the presser foot on my sewing machine to the buttonhole foot and set the appropriate width for the buttonhole according to the instructions for my sewing machine. Other sewing machine models may have different instructions and settings for making buttonholes. Also, if you don't have a special buttonhole foot, remember that you can always make buttonholes by hand. I thread the needle on the wrong side of the vest. I tie knots and hide the thread ends inside the fabric. I insert the needle so that it's not visible from the right side or the wrong side of the fabric, keeping it between the layers of fabric. I pull the thread through and trim it. Buttonholes should be made from the right side of the vest. I use a blade like this one for making the buttonhole openings. Be careful not to cut too much and accidentally cut more than necessary. Finally, I sew on the buttons. See you in the next lesson. Bye.